The humid Atlanta air hung heavy over the Sapphire Estate as I pulled my silver 2015 Honda Accord into the circular driveway. The car rattled slightly, a sound that felt out of place among the fleet of pristine Mercedes and Range Rovers lining the valet stand. I saw my brother Terrell standing near the grand entrance. He looked sharp in his tailored suit, but his face twisted into a mask of pure disgust the moment he spotted my vehicle. Before I could even put the car in park, he marched toward me, his expensive leather shoes clicking aggressively against the pavement. He did not wait for me to roll down the window completely before he began his assault. Terrell leaned down, gripping the door frame, and his voice was a sharp blade. He told me that I needed to turn this heap of junk around and leave immediately. He said that Sloane's family was already inside, and they were people of high pedigree and ancient lineage. He screamed that I was a stain on the family image and a pathetic reminder of a life they were trying to outrun. My own brother looked at me like I was something he had stepped in on the sidewalk. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick wad of cash. With a flick of his wrist, he threw $500 into my lap. The bills scattered across my seat like fallen leaves. He told me to take the money and disappear for the weekend so I would not embarrass him in front of his new wealthy in-laws. He treated me like a beggar at his gates. As I sat there, the weight of the bills on my lap felt incredibly ironic. My mind flashed back to only 14 days ago. I remembered the cool, smooth sensation of the mahogany desk in my private office as I signed a check for $25,000. That check was the initial deposit for this very venue, the Sapphire Estate. I was the invisible hand that had fed this family for 15 long years. I was the one who paid for Terrell's private tutors, his car payments, and even the engagement ring currently sitting on Sloane's finger. They saw a struggling sister in a beat-up car, but they failed to see the woman who owned the ground they stood on. I had spent over a decade playing the role of the humble provider, staying in the shadows while they basked in the light of my hard work. At that moment, watching Terrell sneer at me, the silence I had maintained for years finally began to break. I shifted my gaze past my brother to where Mama Eloise stood near the stone pillars of the entrance. She looked radiant in her champagne-colored silk dress and the wide-brimmed silk hat that sat perfectly on her head. I had paid $450 for that hat just last month because she insisted it was the only thing that would make her feel like a queen at her son's wedding. I waited for her to intervene. I waited for the woman who raised me to tell Terrell that he was being cruel and that his sister deserved respect. My heart hammered against my ribs as I caught her eye, but instead of speaking up, Mama Eloise simply raised a gloved hand to adjust the brim of her expensive hat. She looked at me for a split second, then she deliberately turned her face away and began a hollow conversation with one of the wealthy guests. The silence from my mother was louder than any of Terrell's insults. In that frozen moment, the final pillar of my faith in this family crumbled into dust. For 15 years, I had convinced myself that my financial sacrifices were the glue holding us together. I had worked 80-hour weeks and lived in a modest apartment just so they could have the best of everything. I thought I was buying us a future of security and mutual love. But as I watched my mother choose the facade of status over the daughter who had carried her through every crisis, the truth became blindingly clear. My generosity had not fostered gratitude. It had only fed a toxic monster of entitlement. I had not been protecting my family. I had been funding my own erasure. A cold, sharp clarity washed over me, replacing the pain with a sense of iron purpose. I looked down at the floor of my car, where the last $100 bill lay near the brake pedal. I reached down and picked it up with a steady hand. The paper felt crisp between my fingers. I looked back at Terrell, who was still wearing a smug and victorious grin. I did not cry, and I did not argue. Instead, I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that I understood perfectly. I told him, "Fine, Terrell, have it your way, and congratulations on the wedding." He thought he had won a battle, but he had no idea that I was about to end the entire war. I steered my Honda Accord away from the Sapphire Estate, the engine roaring as if it felt the fire burning in my chest. I drove straight toward the glass towers of downtown Atlanta, leaving the suburbs behind. I pulled into the private underground parking garage of the Legacyholdings building. I did not head for the visitor section. Instead, I swiped my executive badge and watched the heavy iron gate slide open. I stepped out of the car, and my demeanor shifted. I was no longer the unemployed sister or the family disappointment. I walked toward the private elevator with a stride that commanded the room. When the doors opened on the 40th floor, the receptionist stood up, immediately greeting me as Ms. Dominique with a tone of deep respect. I marched past the mahogany desks and the floor to ceiling windows until I reached my corner office. I sat down at my desk and pulled my black titanium credit card from my wallet. It felt heavy and cold, a symbol of the wealth I had carefully hidden to protect their fragile egos. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for the premium wedding coordinator. When she answered, I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told her that I was the primary account holder for the Terrell and Sloan wedding gala. I informed her that I was exercising my right to cancel every premium service immediately. I told her to stop the floral delivery, cancel the 10-piece orchestra, and send the gourmet catering team home. She sounded panicked, stuttering about the hundreds of guests and the reputation of the venue. I told her firmly that the party was over because the bank was closed. Then I made the second call to the luxury travel agency. My voice was steady as I gave them my authorization code. I instructed them to cancel the all-inclusive honeymoon package to the Maldives. I watched the confirmation screen on my computer as the $40,000 transaction was reversed and flagged for refund. That money represented months of my labor, and I refused to let it fund a romantic escape for a man who had just thrown $500 at me like I was trash. As I hung up the phone, the office was silent, but the air felt electric. For 15 years, I had built their world, and in less than 10 minutes, I had begun to tear it down. I did not stop with the wedding expenses. My fingers moved swiftly across my desk phone as I dialed the utility companies. I provided my security pins and social security number to verify my ownership of the luxury condominium in Buckhead, where Terrell had been living rent-free. I instructed the customer service agents to terminate the electricity, water, and gas services effective immediately. I told them that I did not care if it was a Friday afternoon or that the weekend was approaching. I wanted that unit dark and cold. Next, I called my personal attorney, Marcus Thorne. I told him to pull the lease agreement for the property on Peachtree Street. I had drafted that contract as a formality, charging Terrell a symbolic $1 per month. However, I had included a strict morality and conduct clause. I told Marcus that the tenant had committed a gross violation of familial conduct and verbal harassment. I ordered him to file an emergency eviction notice and to have it served at the wedding reception if possible. I wanted Terrell to understand that his shelter was a privilege I provided, not a right he earned. As I sat back in my leather chair, my cell phone buzzed on the desk. A text message appeared from Sloan, my brother's future wife. She wrote that she hoped the $500 Terrell gave me was enough for me to buy a decent outfit so I could stand outside the gates and watch their carriage arrive. She added a laughing emoji, mocking my supposed poverty. The arrogance in her words was a venomous reminder of why this family needed a harsh awakening. I did not hesitate. I typed a reply that felt like a slap. I told her that the silk blouse I was wearing at that very moment cost more than her entire life story combined. I told her to enjoy her grand entrance while she could, because the floor beneath her feet was no longer stable. I hit send and watched the message deliver with a sense of grim satisfaction. I was no longer playing the part of the quiet provider. I was the architect of their downfall, and I was just getting started. Every penny they had spent and every comfort they had enjoyed was tied to my mercy, and my mercy had officially run out. The morning of the wedding arrived with a clear blue sky, but the atmosphere inside the chapel was anything but serene. I arrived late on purpose, slipping into the very last row of the sanctuary, just as the organ music began to swell. I was dressed in a floor-length black silk gown with a matching lace veil that draped elegantly over my shoulders. I looked less like a wedding guest and more like a widow attending a high-stakes funeral. Guests whispered as they glanced back at me, their eyes questioning my somber attire, but I remained as still as a marble statue. My presence was a silent protest, a dark shadow in a room filled with forced white smiles and expensive floral arrangements that I knew were no longer being replenished. Behind the heavy oak doors of the vestry, a different kind of drama was unfolding. I knew exactly what was happening because I had timed my final strike with surgical precision. The banquet manager had been instructed to collect the final payment for the premium wine and champagne service, a bill totaling $15,000 before the ceremony officially commenced. Terrell had swaggered into the office reaching for his wallet with the misplaced confidence of a man who thought his sister's bank account was an infinite well. But when he swiped the card I had previously authorized for his use, the machine emitted a sharp, mocking beep. The words declined appeared in cold, digital letters on the screen. He tried another card, then another, his face turning a deep shade of crimson, as the manager calmly informed him that none of the transactions were successful. Chaos erupted in the wings of the chapel. I could hear the muffled sounds of raised voices and the frantic pacing of polished shoes. Terrell emerged from the side door, his tuxedo jacket disheveled and sweat beading on his forehead. He scanned the crowd with wide, desperate eyes until he finally locked onto me, sitting calmly in the back. He began to march toward me, his hand outstretched, as if he expected me to hand over a miracle. I did not move an inch. I simply picked up a glass of ice water from a nearby pedestal and took a slow, deliberate sip. I watched him struggle through the sea of wealthy guests, his mouth opening to call my name, but I met his gaze with a look of utter indifference. He had wanted me to be invisible, and now even as he looked directly at me, I was a ghost he could no longer reach. The man who had thrown $500 at me was now realizing that without my signature, his entire world was nothing but a house of cards. The heavy doors of the chapel finally closed, and the ceremony began, despite the frantic whispers behind the altar. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the palpable tension of a brewing storm. As the minister stood before the congregation, his voice boomed through the silent room, reciting the ancient words of the marriage liturgy. Then came the moment that every person in the room expected to pass without incident. The minister looked out at the sea of faces and asked if there was anyone present who had cause to object to this union. He paused, a mere formality in his mind, but I did not let the silence linger. I stood up from the back row, my black silk dress rustling like a warning. I did not scream, and I did not cry. I walked down the center aisle with the calm authority of a woman who had already won. I reached the front, and before the shocked minister could react, I took the microphone from the stand with a steady hand. I looked at my brother, whose face was now a pale mask of terror, and then at Sloane, who looked at me with pure venom. I spoke into the microphone, my voice echoing clearly, so that every wealthy guest and every family member could hear. I told them that I was not there to object to the marriage based on sentiment or petty grievances. I told the crowd that I was simply there to reclaim my property. A gasp rippled through the pews, but I continued without hesitation. I announced to the entire room that this grand estate, the very floor they stood on, was owned by Legacy Holdings. I revealed that I was the chief executive officer of that firm and that every dime spent on this charade had come from my personal accounts. I pointed a finger at Sloane and informed the congregation that the designer dress she wore was unpaid for because I had canceled the transaction an hour ago. I looked at Terrell and told him that the diamond ring on his finger was corporate property that had been obtained through a line of credit I had now severed. The room erupted into a symphony of shocked whispers and outraged cries. Sloane began to shriek that I was a liar, but her voice was drowned out as the side doors of the chapel swung open. 4 large men in dark suits, my personal security team from Legacy Holdings, marched down the aisles. I spoke into the microphone one last time, informing the wedding party that because all contracts had been terminated for breach of conduct and non-payment, they were all now officially trespassing. I ordered my security team to escort the trespassers out of the building immediately. I watched as the fairy tale crumbled into a chaotic mess of silk and tears. The high pedigree family Sloane had bragged about was now being ushered toward the parking lot like common criminals. As the chapel cleared, I stood alone at the altar, finally breathing the air of a room that I owned in every sense of the word. The doorbell to my penthouse rang 2 days after the wedding collapse. I opened the door to find Mama Eloise standing there, her eyes red from crying, but her back was as stiff as a board. It was the first time she had ever seen where I truly lived, but she did not marvel at the marble floors or the breathtaking view of the Atlanta skyline. Instead, she marched into my living room and began to weaponize her motherhood. She did not offer an apology for turning her back on me at the estate. She did not ask why I had been pushed to such an extreme. Instead, she began to preach about the sanctity of family and the obligations of a big sister. She called me a cold-hearted and selfish woman who had let her pride destroy her brother's future. She looked me in the eye and told me that I was a traitor to our bloodline, claiming that I had shamed the family name more than Terrell ever could. I let her finish her sermon in silence. When she finally ran out of breath, I walked over to my mahogany desk and picked up a heavy leather-bound folder. I dropped it on the coffee table with a loud thud that made her flinch. I told her that there were 500 pages of truth in that folder. I began to flip through the pages, pointing at the cold, hard evidence of her hypocrisy. I showed her the receipts for the $80,000 in medical bills I had paid when she had no insurance. I showed her the bank transfers for Terrell's elite university tuition, which totaled over $120,000. I even pulled out the records for the $15,000 I had secretly paid to clear our cousin's gambling debts just to keep the family safe from collectors. I looked at her stunned face and asked her where she thought that money came from. I reminded her that while she was busy praising Terrell for his potential, the unemployed daughter she looked down upon was the one keeping the lights on. I told her that every meal she ate and every designer hat she wore was a result of my labor and my sacrifice. I shouted that I was not the one who betrayed the bloodline, but that they were the ones who had bled me dry and then asked for more. I told her that her lessons on morality were worthless because she had no integrity. For 15 years, I had been the silent foundation of their lives, but I told her that as of this moment, the foundation had collapsed and I would not be the one to rebuild it. The courtroom was cold and smelled of floor wax when we gathered for the emergency hearing. Terrell sat at the plaintiff's table looking pathetic in a cheap suit that lacked the crispness of the luxury clothes I used to buy for him. He had filed a lawsuit against me for unlawful eviction, claiming that I had traumatized him and his new bride by kicking them out of their home without notice. He wept crocodile tears for the judge, painting me as a vengeful sister who had abused her power to ruin his life. He actually believed that he could use the legal system to force me to continue funding his lifestyle. His lawyer argued that the $1 monthly rent agreement constituted a long-term lease that I could not simply dissolve on a whim. They wanted the judge to grant him immediate re-entry to the condominium and a settlement of $50,000 for emotional distress. I waited for my turn with a calm that unnerved them. When I took the stand, I did not talk about feelings or family loyalty. I presented a stack of notarized documents that silenced the entire room. I showed the court that Terrell had not only violated the morality clause of our agreement, but he had also committed a felony. I produced evidence that he had forged my signature on a loan application for $60,000 to cover his secret gambling debts and the remaining balance on Sloane's engagement ring. I brought in a handwriting expert who confirmed that the signature was a clumsy imitation of my own. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to grim as he looked over the fraudulent papers. Terrell's face turned from a pale white to a sickly gray as he realized that he had walked into a trap of his own making. The judge did not take long to reach a decision. He dismissed the eviction lawsuit with prejudice, stating that Terrell had no legal or moral ground to stand on. Furthermore, the judge referred the evidence of forgery to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. Terrell was not just losing a house, he was facing the very real possibility of 10 years in prison. In that moment of total defeat, Sloane stood up from the gallery. She did not go to comfort her husband. Instead, she walked to the front and handed a set of papers to Terrell's lawyer. She announced to the court that she was filing for an immediate annulment and divorce. She looked at Terrell with a disgust that surpassed even my own, realizing that her prince was nothing but a high-end parasite. I walked out of that courtroom without looking back, leaving them both to drown in the wreckage of their own greed. I spent the following morning packing my belongings into 2 leather suitcases. I did not need much because I was leaving the ghosts of my past behind. As I folded a silk scarf, my phone began to vibrate on the marble countertop. The caller ID showed it was Mama Eloise. I hesitated for a moment before answering, and immediately the sound of her frantic sobbing filled the room. She was not calling to ask how I was or to apologize for the disaster at the courthouse. She was weeping because the 2 maids and the gardener had walked out after their checks bounced. She cried that she had no money to pay the staff or to buy the premium groceries she was used to. She pleaded with me to send just $5,000 to cover the immediate expenses, promising that she would make Terrell apologize once he was out of trouble. Her voice sounded thin and desperate, but it no longer had the power to make me feel guilty. I stood by the window, looking out at the city I had helped build with my own sweat and tears. I told her very calmly that the Bank of Dominique was permanently closed. I told her that I had already paid my debt to her with 15 years of my youth and every ounce of my sanity. I reminded her that while I was working through holidays and birthdays to fund her comfort, she was busy treating me like an outcast. I told her that it was time for her to learn the true cost of the life she led. My final words to her were that I was finally choosing to live for myself. I hung up the phone before she could respond with more hollow excuses. With a steady thumb, I went into my contacts and blocked her number along with every other person who shared my last name. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had heard in a decade. The cabin of the Boeing 787 was nearly silent as I settled into my oversized leather seat in the first-class section. Outside the window, the lights of Atlanta began to shrink into a shimmering carpet of gold as the plane climbed toward the Atlantic Ocean. I reached into my small travel bag and pulled out a single crumpled $100 bill. It was the very same bill I had retrieved from the floor of my car after Terrell threw his pathetic bribe at me. I looked at the face of Benjamin Franklin and felt a surge of triumph that no amount of corporate success could ever match. When the flight attendant arrived, I did not use my credit card. I handed her the $100 bill and asked for their finest bottle of French vintage wine. I told her to keep the change as a tip for her excellent service. As the cool ruby liquid hit the back of my throat, I felt the last of the bitterness dissolve. I was no longer a daughter, a sister, or a financial safety net for people who did not value my soul. 10 hours later, I stepped out into the crisp morning air of Paris. The city was alive with the sound of distant accordions and the smell of fresh croissants, a world away from the toxic expectations of my family. I walked down the boulevard with my head held high, my footsteps echoing against the ancient cobblestones. I watched the thousands of strangers passing by, and for the first time in 35 years, I felt completely anonymous and entirely powerful. I was no longer a walking ATM or a family scapegoat. I was a woman who had reclaimed her kingdom from the ruins of betrayal. I merged into the vibrant crowd near the Seine River, disappearing into a future that belonged only to me. I was the queen of my own life, and the throne was finally secure. This story serves as a powerful reminder that no is a complete sentence, and setting boundaries is an act of self-love, not selfishness. For too long, we are taught that family loyalty requires unconditional tolerance of disrespect. However, enabling toxic behavior only destroys both the giver and the receiver. Real strength is found in the courage to walk away from tables where respect is no longer served. Your value is not defined by how much you provide, but by how you honor your own spirit. True freedom begins when you stop seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you.